1674, Castile. The midwife's shriek ripped through the birthing room, a sound more akin to terror than triumph. Not a cry of celebration for new life, but a guttural expulsion of fear, echoing the grotesque reality that lay between Maria's bloodied thighs. Eugenia Martinez Vallejo, born not into the world, but thrust upon it as a living blasphemy. From the moment her bulging eyes blinked open, she defied God's supposed design. Limbs like tree trunks, a hunger that bordered on the apocalyptic, and a cry that could shatter glass. She was a monster forged in the crucible of a peasant womb. Forget whispers of divine wrath. This was an affront to nature itself, a fleshy gargoyle sprung from the loins of unsuspecting farmers. Maria, broken in body and spirit, could barely lift the creature that had once resided within her. Each attempt was a symphony of strained muscles and stifled sobs. Her back screamed under the impossible weight. Her arms trembled with the burden of a child who seemed to have devoured a village in utero. The villagers, their faces etched with the harsh lines of survival in the arid hills, gathered at the well, their tongues sharpened by fear and superstition. "Such a child is not natural," they hissed, their voices hushed but laced with venom. "God would not make one so foul." The midwife, her eyes sunk deep into a web of wrinkles, crossed herself repeatedly, muttering incantations against evil spirits. The priest, Father Alonso, normally a bastion of placid authority, eyed Eugenia with a mixture of morbid curiosity and theological dread. He saw not a child, but a puzzle, a monstrous equation that threatened the very foundations of his faith. Thomas, the father, a man weathered by sun and toil, bore the shame in silence. He had prayed for a son, a strong back to help him coax life from the unforgiving soil. Instead, he got this fleshy aberration. But even as his mind recoiled, something twisted in his heart when he looked into Eugenia's eyes, wide and dark with innocent confusion. She was his daughter, cursed or not. He couldn't deny the bond, the primal tug that connected him to this creature of abnormal size. He watched as the other children, their faces contorted with fear and disgust, pelted her with stones, chanting, "Monstrua! Monstrua!" Eugenia learned early to seek refuge by the hearth, where her mother's touch offered fleeting moments of solace, where her mother's voice attempted to provide a blanket of comfort, though she herself couldn't accept reality. "God made you as you are," Maria would murmur, but the words cracked like brittle clay. This was not God's design. This was an anomaly, an insult, a cosmic joke played on a family already burdened by hardship. By 6, Eugenia was a prisoner of her own flesh. Walking was an agonizing struggle, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her skin stretched taut over her swollen limbs, angry red welts marking the points where the weight pressed hardest. The village physician, a charlatan more interested in spectacle than medicine, declared her a medical curiosity, a thing to be studied, not healed. Thus, Eugenia's world shrunk to the confines of their tiny cottage, the flickering firelight painting monstrous shadows on the walls, amplifying the whispers that carried on the wind, whispers that would soon reach the ears of those who wielded power far beyond the arid hills of Castile, whispers that would change her life forever.
Burnt wheat clung to the wind, a scent of despair mingling with the dust devils that danced across the parched fields. Then the glint of sunlight on polished steel ripped through the monotony. A horseman, his doublet emblazoned with the royal crest, a symbol of power and oppression, shattered the fragile peace of Briga. He arrived not as a savior, but as a harbinger of a fate far more terrifying than starvation. The villagers, their faces a mask of awe and dread, clustered around the Martinez Vallejo cottage, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. Thomas, his hands stained with the earth that had both sustained and betrayed him, stepped forward, his fingers trembling as he received the parchment. The royal seal, a mark of authority he had only glimpsed in the dim recesses of the church, seemed to burn into his skin. The village scribe, his voice cracking under the weight of the pronouncement, read aloud the words that would shatter Eugenia's already fragile existence. by order of His Most Catholic Majesty Charles II, King of Spain. The child, known as Eugenia Martinez Vallejo, is summoned to the royal court of Madrid, there to be presented before the nobility for examination and amusement. The crowd erupted in a murmur of shock and speculation. Maria, her face a mask of terror, clutched Eugenia to her chest, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. "No," she whispered, a desperate plea against the inevitable. The horseman's expression remained implacable, a stone face hardened by years of servitude. The king's will is not to be questioned. The child is a wonder, a marvel of God's creation. His Majesty wishes to behold her. A lie, wrapped in silk and steel. Eugenia, her round face flushed with confusion, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, what do they want?" Maria could not answer. Her throat had closed around the words, choked by fear and the suffocating weight of powerlessness. The preparations were swift and brutal, a whirlwind of activity that tore Eugenia from the familiar comfort of her home. 2 days later, a carriage arrived, its velvet curtains drawn against prying eyes, a mobile prison awaiting its fleshy cargo. The village seamstress, her fingers nimble but her heart heavy, stitched together a gown of rough-spun wool, dyed a faded blue. The fabric strained at the seams, a poor attempt to conceal the marvel within. Eugenia's hair, normally left loose and tangled, was pinned beneath a linen cap, another layer of concealment, another attempt to erase her peasant origins. "Be brave," Thomas told her, his voice thick with unshed tears. He pressed a small wooden cross into her palm, a symbol of faith that felt increasingly hollow. "God goes with you." Eugenia nodded, her lower lip trembling. She did not understand why she was being taken, only that her parents' faces were etched with a grief that mirrored her own fear. The journey to Madrid was a blur of dust and jolting wheels. The carriage, though grand by village standards, was a stifling cage, amplifying Eugenia's discomfort. Her body ached from the constant motion, her skin chafing against the unfamiliar fabric. The horseman, a man named Don Alvaro, treated her with contempt, barking orders and offering no comfort. "Stay still," he snapped when she shifted uncomfortably. "You are to be presented as a curiosity, not a squalling peasant." At night, they stopped at inns, where Eugenia was hidden away in back rooms, lest curious travelers glimpse the king's prize before its grand unveiling. She ate alone, her meals brought by silent servants who averted their eyes, as if afraid to catch her curse. She once overheard 2 maids whispering in hushed tones. "They say she weighs as much as a grown ox. Poor creature. Do you think she knows what they'll do to her?" Eugenia did not sleep that night. When the spires of Madrid finally pierced the horizon, her stomach twisted with dread. The city was a roaring beast of noise and stench, a world away from the quiet hills of Braga. The carriage rolled through gates adorned with golden crests, past guards and polished breastplates, into a world of marble and gilt, a world where she was nothing more than a freak show exhibit. As the carriage halted in a sunlit courtyard, Don Alvaro yanked open the door. "Out," he commanded, his voice cold and dismissive. "And remember, you are here to be seen, not heard." Eugenia stepped down, her legs unsteady. Around her, courtiers in silks and jewels paused mid-conversation, their eyes locking onto her with a hunger that made her skin crawl. A man in a powdered wig leaned toward his companion, his fan fluttering nervously. "So this is the monstrous child. How delightfully grotesque." Eugenia's fingers tightened around the cross in her palm. Somewhere beyond those towering doors the king awaited, and with him a fate she could not yet fathom, a fate that would transform her into a spectacle, a joke, a living embodiment of their cruel amusement.
The grand hall of the Alcazar was a sensory assault, a swirling vortex of candlelight, perfume, and hushed whispers. Eugenia stood frozen at the center of the polished floor, her bare feet sinking slightly into the plush carpet. The air, thick with beeswax and rosewater, suffocated her, a stark contrast to the clean, dry air of the hills. Around her, the nobility of Spain had gathered in a glittering semicircle, their silks rustling like the wings of restless birds, their eyes fixed upon her, dissecting her with their gaze. "Look at the size of her!" A woman in a towering lace headdress tittered behind her fan. "Like a barrel with legs!" Eugenia's face burned with shame, but she kept her eyes fixed on the ground, the wooden cross digging into her palm, a small, sharp reminder of home, of a life that now seemed a distant dream. At the far end of the hall, beneath a canopy of crimson velvet, sat King Charles II, his face pale and elongated, his lower jaw jutting slightly, a legacy of generations of royal inbreeding. His dark eyes, though dulled by illness, gleamed with something akin to fascination as he gestured for her to come closer. "Bring her forth," he commanded, his voice thin but carrying through the hall. Don Alvaro nudged Eugenia forward with the tip of his boot, a silent reminder of her place in this gilded hierarchy. She stumbled, her breath hitching as laughter rippled through the crowd. "Careful, or she'll crack the tiles," a nobleman called out, earning a chorus of snickers. The king ignored them, leaning forward in his gilded chair. "Turn," he ordered. Eugenia hesitated, unsure. "Turn," Don Alvaro hissed, seizing her shoulder and spinning her roughly. The room erupted in gasps and delighted exclamations. "Marvelous!" A bishop in embroidered robes clapped his hands. "Such abundance must be a sign of divine favor, or perhaps divine jest." Eugenia's vision blurred. She could feel their stares like hot brands against her skin, tracing the swell of her belly, the thickness of her arms, the grotesqueness of her form. A man in a feathered hat sketched her hastily on a scrap of parchment, exaggerating her proportions until she resembled a monstrous caricature. "Can she dance?" a duchess asked, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. Before Eugenia could react, a fiddler struck up a lively tune. The nobles clapped in rhythm, their smiles sharp and predatory. "Go on, then. Show us how a peasant girl celebrates." Tears pricked Eugenia's eyes, but she forced her legs to move. She swayed awkwardly, her arms flailing as she struggled to maintain her balance, each step a testament to her humiliation. The laughter grew louder, more insistent, a cacophony of cruel delight. Someone threw a sugared almond, striking her cheek and rolling across the floor. "Enough!" The command came not from the king, but from a slender woman at his side, Queen Mariana, her face lined with weariness, her eyes shadowed with a weariness that mirrored Eugenia's own. For a moment, the hall fell silent, the laughter stifled, the spectacle paused. But Charles II waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense! The girl amuses me." He turned to a servant. "Have her fed. I wish to see how much she can consume." A table was brought forth, laden with roasted meats, sweetmeats, and flagons of wine, a feast designed to amplify her grotesqueness. The nobles pressed closer, their eyes alight with anticipation, their appetites whetted by the prospect of further humiliation. "Eat," the king said, his voice a challenge. Eugenia's stomach twisted. At home, hunger had been a constant companion, gnawing at her even as her body swelled. But here, the food was a weapon, another tool to be used against her, another spectacle for their twisted entertainment. She reached for a loaf of bread, her fingers trembling. The moment she bit into it, the room erupted in cheers. "Like a pig at trough," a courtier crowed, earning a fresh wave of laughter. Eugenia chewed mechanically, the bread turning to ash in her mouth, each bite a surrender to their cruelty. The queen's gaze met hers briefly, a flicker of something that might have been pity before she looked away, retreating behind the wall of her own gilded cage. When the platters were emptied, the king yawned, his boredom signaling the end of the performance. "Take her away," he commanded. "We will have her again tomorrow." As guards led her from the hall, the whispers followed, clinging to her like a shroud. "Did you see how she gorged? A creature of pure appetite. How exquisite!" Eugenia's fingers tightened around the cross until it drew blood. That night, in the tiny chamber they had given her, more a cell than a room, she pressed her face into the straw mattress and wept, her body racked with sobs, her spirit broken by the weight of their judgment. Outside, the moon cast silver light over the palace walls, indifferent to her suffering. Somewhere in the labyrinth of corridors, a painter sharpened his quill, eager to capture the king's new favorite oddity, to immortalize her shame on canvas. And so began Eugenia's life as a spectacle, a never-ending parade of humiliation.
The summons came at dawn, a harsh rapping on the iron latch of her chamber door. Eugenia barely stirred as a page boy, his fingers stained with ink, tossed a scrap of parchment onto the straw. "Up, monstrua," he sneered. "The king has commanded your presence in the portrait gallery." The word "commanded" hit her. Her body ached from the previous night's humiliation, the aftertaste of their cruel delight still lingering in her mouth. The wine had dried sticky on her skin, and her knees were still raw from the forced dance that had ended in a spectacular fall. But refusal was not an option. Resistance was a luxury she could no longer afford. The gallery was a long, vaulted hall lined with the faces of kings and queens, their oil-painted eyes following her as she shuffled forward, each portrait a silent accusation. At the far end, beneath a canopy of velvet drapes, stood a wiry man in a paint-splattered doublet, his fingers drumming impatiently against his easel. "Ah, the subject arrives," he said, his voice sharp with disdain. "I am Don Sebastian de Herrera, court painter to His Majesty. You will sit as I command." He looked at her as if she was a piece of furniture he needed to move. Eugenia hesitated. I do not understand." She had not asked a question. He was not meant to converse. The noblewoman, her skin flawless despite her age, and her hair intricately woven, leaned back against the wall and fanned herself with a delicate titter. "Oh, how droll! The creature thinks she has a choice." Don Sebastian gestured to a raised platform, its surface draped in heavy brocade. "Climb, and do not move once you are in position." The platform groaned under Eugenia's weight as she settled onto it, feeling like a prisoner awaiting her public execution. The painter circled her like a vulture, his gaze dissecting her from every angle, reducing her to a collection of curves and shadows. "Turn your face to the light," he ordered, as if he was speaking to an animal. "No, chin up. Let them see the fullness of you." Eugenia obeyed, her hands clenched in her lap, her heart a trapped bird beating against her ribs. The nobles had begun to gather, whispering behind their gloves, their words like tiny daggers pricking her skin. "Will he paint her as she is, or as she feels?" one marquis mused, his tone laced with a subtle cruelty. "As she is would be horror enough," his companion replied, earning a stifled snicker. Don Sebastian dipped his brush into a swirl of ochre and began, his movements swift and ruthless, as if he wanted to erase the subject altogether. He did not paint her as a person, with all the complexities of life. No, she was a study, a grotesque marvel to be immortalized for the amusement of future generations, a painting that would never see life or love. "Hold still," he snapped when she shifted, his voice sharp with irritation, "unless you wish to be remembered as a blur of indecency." The session stretched for hours, each second an eternity of suffering, the pain growing slowly. Eugenia's back stiffened, her breath growing shallow under the weight of scrutiny. She thought of her village, the smell of wheat. The painter's eyes flicked between her and the canvas, his mouth twisting in dissatisfaction. "More," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "More of the folds, the bulk. Let them see the absurdity of God's handiwork." A servant brought a platter of fruit, and the nobles nibbled as they watched, their laughter muffled behind silk sleeves, each laugh and scoff slicing at her soul. "Will he include the way her dress strains at the seams?" a duchess asked, her eyes sparkling with perverse fascination. "Of course," Don Sebastian replied without looking up, his attention focused solely on his canvas. "Every glorious imperfection." Eugenia's vision blurred. She focused on a crack in the far wall, letting her mind drift far from this gilded prison, seeking refuge in memories of Brihuega, of the dry wind through the olive trees, of her mother's voice humming by the fire.
A sharp clap shattered the illusion, bringing her back to the cold reality of her existence. "Enough for today," the painter declared, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression a mixture of relief and disgust. "Tomorrow we shall capture the magnificence of her profile." As Eugenia stepped down from the platform, her legs numb, a pageboy darted forward with a mischievous smirk. "The king wishes to see the progress." The royal wish had been made. Don Sebastian turned the canvas toward the gathered courtiers, revealing his cruel creation to their eager eyes. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, a symphony of shock and delight. There she was, Eugenia Martinez Vallejo, rendered in cruel, unflinching detail, forever immortalized as their source of amusement. Her body ballooned grotesquely on the canvas, her face a mask of vacant suffering, her eyes hollow and defeated. The painter had exaggerated every curve, every crease, every flaw, until she resembled less a girl and more a monstrous caricature of excess, of the world's desire. "Exquisite," the king murmured, his pale fingers tracing the edge of the frame, his eyes gleaming with perverse satisfaction. Eugenia's throat tightened. This was to be her legacy. Not a life, not a story, but a joke in oils, a spectacle frozen in time for the entertainment of future generations. As the courtiers applaud, their enthusiasm a testament to their cruelty, she turned away, unable to bear their scrutiny any longer. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in a gilded mirror on the wall, a distorted shadow of the girl she once was. The girl staring back was unrecognizable, a grotesque distortion, a thing of pity and ridicule, an eternal source of laughter. And the worst part was that the painting was only half finished. The final touch was a mark against her soul.